Corporal Bill Hatton. A U.S. Marine corporal admitted that he and other Americans fed Vietnamese children peanut butter cracker sandwiches with trioxane heat tablets hidden inside. The tablets burned the lining of their throats and even burned holes in their stomachs, as trioxane is a solid fuel tablet from military rations used to heat food, and it is not meant to be eaten. The corporal's name was Bill Hatton, and his statement went further than just the heat tablets. He said his unit threw cases of C rations off moving trucks at women and children. He described how they fired mad minutes from their position, a Miria shelter bombing. At 4:30 in the morning on the 13th of February 1991, two U.S. Air Force stealth bombers dropped laser-guided bombs on public shelter number 25 in Baghdad's Amiria district. The shelter had been built during the Iran-Iraq War and was used by families for protection. On that night, it was crowded with hundreds of civilians, including women and children, trying to survive the Gulf War air campaign. The first bomb cut through 9.8 feet of reinforced concrete before exploding. Minutes later, the second bomb followed the same path and detonated inside. People outside heard screams for several minutes, then silence. Inside, more than 400 civilians were killed. Those on the upper floors were burned alive instantly, while others died when boiling water from burst tanks scalded them. Survivors described blackened handprints fused to ceilings, corpses melted together into blocks of flesh, and a layer of human fat floating on the water pumped in by firefighters. The U.S. military later said they believed the shelter had been turned into a military command post, and they pointed to intercepted signals and surveillance reports as proof. But even some senior U.S. officers doubted this evidence, calling it circumstantial. Human Rights Watch and journalists who visited the site found no trace of military use, and they reported that the shelter was clearly marked as a civilian refuge. Today, the ruins stand as a memorial, with photographs of the dead on the walls. Charred handprints and burned ceilings remain in place. A woman named Greda, who lost 8 children in the bombing, became the caretaker and guide for visitors. Laconia Incident. On the 12th of September 1942, the German submarine U-156 torpedoed the British ship RMS Laconia off the coast of West Africa. Because the Laconia was armed, it was considered a normal legal military target. But once the submarine's commander, Werner Hartenstein, realized that most of the people in the water were Italian prisoners of war and civilians, he began a rescue effort. He sent open radio messages in English giving his position, promised not to attack, and called for help. Other submarines came to assist and collect the survivors. The rescue scene was chaotic, as the Laconia had tilted so badly that many of its lifeboats could not be launched. Prisoners locked below broke out, and desperate fights erupted as they rushed towards the boats to save their lives. Some men were bayoneted as they tried to reach the boats, while others were slashed or shot when climbing aboard. Sharks circled in the bloody water. U-156 stayed on the surface, carrying nearly 200 survivors on its deck and towing more in lifeboats. Then, on the 16th of September, a US B-24 bomber spotted the submarine. It saw the Red Cross flag and even received signals in English, some from Hartenstein himself, others from a British officer aboard, explaining that there were survivors, including women and children. The aircrew reported this, but their commander ordered an attack. Bombs and depth charges fell among the lifeboats, killing many people, and forced U-156 to release the survivors and dive to save itself. Other submarines continued the rescue, but still, the death toll was staggering. Out of 2,732 people on the Laconia, only about 976 to 1,083 survived, and between 1,658 and 1,757 died, most of them Italian prisoners of war. Meanwhile, the American airmen reported that they had sunk U-156, received medals for the attack, and faced no investigation or punishment. The case was quietly dropped. The bombing of a rescue effort shocked the German Navy, and because of this, on September 17th, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz issued the Laconia Order, forbidding U-boats from rescuing survivors. From then on, German submarines followed a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The order became a central issue at the Nuremberg trials, where prosecutors argued that Dönitz and his submariners had committed war crimes. However, the move backfired once the full story of the Laconia incident and Allied practices came out. The tribunal criticized the order for being harsh and unclear, but did not add extra punishment to Dönitz's sentence for this charge. Legal experts later judged the American attack on U-156 as a clear example of a war crime. Under international law, enemy submarines rescuing survivors under a Red Cross flag are not lawful targets while doing so. Maiwand Kill Team. A 15-year-old Afghan boy was working in a field when U.S. soldiers threw a grenade at him, shot him, and then posed for photos with his body. The sergeant then cut off his little finger as a trophy. That was the beginning of the Maiwand district murders, a series of killings carried out in 2010 by a self-named kill team. from the U.S. Army's 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company. A month later, soldiers killed a 22-year-old man, who was later believed to have been deaf or mentally disabled and kept part of his skull. Keeping body parts as trophies was a recurring characteristic of these killings. Then they killed Mullah Adadad with a grenade and gunfire in front of his family. Once again, they amputated a finger and kept it. When local elders complained that Adadad had been unarmed, a platoon leader came back to the village and told residents the man had acted aggressively, insisting the unit did not kill people randomly. However, photos later published by Der Spiegel and Rolling Stone told another story. They showed soldiers smiling over corpses, holding body parts, and even 2 Afghans cuffed together beside a sign that read, "Talibans are dead." Senior NATO officials in Kabul compared the images to the infamous Abu Ghraib prison photos. The truth finally came out because a soldier reported the crimes to his superiors after he had first been beaten by fellow soldiers for speaking up. Another soldier had also tried to raise alarm months earlier by telling his father, who called military hotlines in the US but got no response. Once the army acted, charges spread across the platoon. 5 soldiers were charged with murder, and 7 more faced charges for drug use, assaults, obstruction, and covering up the crimes. In court, one of them, a 22-year-old soldier, admitted guilt to 3 premeditated murders and told the judge the plan was to kill people. He was sentenced to 24 years and agreed to testify against the others. In the end, 11 of the 12 soldiers charged were convicted of crimes connected to the killings or the cover-up, with some receiving life sentences and others lighter punishments. Phoenix Program. The Phoenix Program was created to find and destroy the Viet Cong's political network hidden among ordinary civilians. The idea was straightforward but ruthless. The Viet Cong were not only strong because of their fighters in the jungle, but they also had a hidden system inside their communities. This infrastructure included people who recruited new members, gathered information, spread propaganda, moved supplies, and replaced local leaders with their own. Phoenix was built to break that system, and it used infiltration, capture, interrogation, and targeted killings. Success was measured by how many people were neutralized, with that word covering different outcomes: prison, defection, or death. From 1968 to 1972, they claimed to have neutralized 81,740 suspected Viet Cong, including 26,369 killed. About 87% of those deaths were officially recorded as happening during regular South Vietnamese and American military operations, while the rest were attributed directly to Phoenix operatives. To carry this out, Phoenix relied on provincial reconnaissance units, or PRUs, and a network of interrogation centers. PRU teams grabbed suspects or raided homes where they believed Viet Cong cadres lived. Then, interrogators tried to force out names and structures for the next round of raids. On paper, there were rules. For example, some special laws said that 3 different sources were needed to accuse someone. In practice, though, things were far harsher. Large sweeps often dragged in innocent people. Information gained under interrogation was used to guide search and destroy missions, and torture was part of the process in South Vietnamese centers, with Americans often supervising. Witnesses later described beatings, electric shocks to genitals, water torture, suspension by ropes, rape, and even deaths during questioning. Some extreme claims about Phoenix were later questioned, but even inside the program's own records, there was no doubt about the larger pattern of cruelty. For example, some Vietnamese rivals accused one another of being Viet Cong to settle old disputes. In response to all of this, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong leaders ordered assassinations of Phoenix staff. Later, anger grew as details leaked out. Journalists, veterans, and former officials spoke against it. Congress held hearings where Phoenix was described as a system of murder without faces or names. The CIA defended itself, saying it preferred capturing suspects alive and never officially approved assassinations. Still, public pressure grew, and Phoenix was officially shut down in 1972. A similar program, Plan F6, continued under the South Vietnamese government until the end of the war. Bear River Massacre. At dawn, on a normal day in January, soldiers under Colonel Patrick Edward Connor reached a Native American camp of the Shoshone people. These people had gathered there for the winter because by then, they were already on the edge of survival, as settlers had taken over their land, eaten up their food sources, fenced off fields, and hunted the animals they relied on. Hunger drove some Shoshone to raid farms and supply trains, and settlers asked the army to protect them. Connor, though, wanted a decisive blow. He had already written that he planned to chastise the Shoshone. The Shoshone tried to prepare, digging rifle pits and setting up willow brush as cover, but their weapons were few and often outdated. At first, they held off the soldiers' frontal attack, inflicting most of the U.S. casualties in those early minutes. But then Connor changed tactics. He sent cavalry to attack from the sides and infantry to block escape routes. After about 2 hours of fighting, the Shoshone ran out of ammunition. Once resistance collapsed, the soldiers swept through the lodges. Survivors later said women were raped whipped, and the wounded, including children, were executed. Others hid under piles of bodies or burrowed into the riverbanks. By the end, between 250 and 400 Shoshone were dead, most of them women and children, while only about 21 U.S. soldiers were killed. Connor was initially praised as a hero by most, promoted to brigadier general, and went on to lead more campaigns against Native Americans. The Bear River Massacre is remembered as one of the deadliest single killings of Native Americans by U.S. forces, and for generations it was officially called a battle, but Shoshone oral history kept the truth alive. In 1990, the site was declared a National Historic Landmark. Morro Crater Massacre. In March 1906, a volcanic crater on the island of Jolo became the site of one of the worst events of the Philippine-American War during the Moro Rebellion. Between 800 and 1,000 Tausug Moros, many of them ordinary villagers with their families, had taken shelter inside the crater, and for 4 days, U.S. forces under General Leonard Wood launched a full assault with artillery, naval guns, and machine guns. When it was over, only 6 Moros were still alive. Nearly everyone inside, including men, women, and children, were killed. Although the U.S. recorded it as a victory, the level of killing caused outrage. Newspapers carried headlines about the massacre of women and children, and even some U.S. officers who were close to the scene disagreed with General Wood's defense. Major Hugh Scott later said that the people at Bud Dajo had not planned to fight at all. According to him, they had planted crops and were only trying to live in peace, not start an uprising. General Wood justified the attack by claiming that Moro men had used women and children as shields, and that some women had disguised themselves as fighters. Then, Governor General Henry Clay Ide said that the high number of civilian deaths came from the heavy artillery bombardment. However, some battlefield reports described a Maxim machine gun being used to fire straight into the crater, mowing down the people inside. These contradictions led many to believe that the truth was being covered up. On the American side, about 20 soldiers were killed and 70 were wounded. President Theodore Roosevelt sent Wood a congratulatory message, but the press at home turned against him. The Secretary of War demanded answers about what was being called the wanton slaughter of women and children. Wood took responsibility but insisted the attack had been necessary. Buyo Maru lifeboat killings. During World War II, the U.S. submarine Wahoo torpedoed and sank the Japanese transport ship Buyo Maru in the Pacific. What happened afterward, though, turned it into one of the most controversial moments of the war. Survivors crowded into lifeboats and rafts, and instead of leaving them, the Wahoo opened fire. Machine guns swept across the survivors, scattering bodies into the water. The U.S. Navy later gave its official explanation. A vice admiral claimed the crew of the Wahoo had only acted in self-defense. He said the survivors, Japanese soldiers, had fired first with rifles and machine guns, and it was common for armed troops at sea to resist capture. The submarine's executive officer added that their goal was not to massacre people, but to force them out of the lifeboats so they could not regroup and fight again. However, not every account agreed with this version. An historian wrote that the submarine crew had actually fired first, and that only afterward did some survivors shoot back with handguns. The controversy grew even deeper when it became clear who was in the lifeboats. Alongside Japanese troops were almost 270 prisoners of war. In the end, of the 1,126 people originally aboard the Buyo Maru, 195 Indians and 87 Japanese were killed. Some died when the torpedoes hit the ship, but others were killed in the shootings that followed. The U.S. Navy never officially called the incident a war crime, describing it instead as a harsh but necessary part of submarine warfare. Fort Detrick human experiments. Behind barbed wire in Maryland, the United States once ran its biological weapons headquarters. From 1943 to 1969, Fort Detrick was the center of the U.S. biological weapons program. Scientists there learned how to grow dangerous germs, test ways to deliver them, and develop methods to contain and sterilize them. After World War II, secrecy was so tight that the public did not even learn about the wartime program until months after Japan surrendered. One of the most disturbing choices tied to the program came right after the war. Researchers from Japan's Unit 731, who had carried out lethal human experiments involving infection, temperature extremes, and much more, which we won't even get into here as that is a whole other story, were given immunity from prosecution. In exchange, their director Shiro Ishii handed over thousands of tissue slides from human and animal dissections. Those materials were reportedly stored at Fort Detrick. The base also became a site for U.S. human testing, and in the same period, Fort Detrick's scientists researched the use of insects to spread disease. A scholar who studied this history wrote that U.S. planners approved insect-based biological warfare for use as early as the fall of 1950 and had multiple agents ready. He concluded it is very likely the United States actually used insects dropped from aircraft during the Korean War. That remains his assessment, though, not an official admission. There were some side effects at the base, too. For example, in the 1950s, workers at the base died from anthrax exposure. Another died in 1964 from viral encephalitis. In 2019, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention identified serious safety failures in Fort Detrick's high containment labs and ordered a halt to operations until fixes were made. The official end to offensive biological weapons research came in 1969, when President Richard Nixon shut the program down, and from then, Fort Detrick's mission shifted to defensive work, such as developing diagnostics, prevention, and treatments, and parts of the campus were transferred to public health and cancer research. If you want to discuss this video or suggest an idea for the next one, join my Discord, link in the description.